Chapter 23. Appomattox. With Sheridan on his western flank, Sherman coming up from the south on his rear, and Grant relentlessly pushing the envelope in his front, Lee had no choice but to evacuate his position at Petersburg and leave Richmond unprotected. Lee headed west, the Confederate government headed south, and Lincoln went to Richmond. Lee was expecting to find rations at Appomattox and an escape route to fight another day. Sheridan beat him there and seized his rations. Lee met with Grant to discuss terms while Lincoln returned to Washington. Amid the jubilation and celebrations, Lincoln, rather informally from the second floor of the White House, asked the crowd to look forward to the next task at hand, reconstruction, and to accept Louisiana as a model for Southern states to rejoin the Union. April 3rd, 1865.
With General Sherman's army closing in from the south, General Ulysses S. Grant began his offensive against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, defending Petersburg and Richmond by sending the Union cavalry under General Sheridan to secure the South Side Railroad, the last rail line into Petersburg. On the 1st of April, at a country crossroads in Dinwiddie County known as Five Forks, 12 miles west of Petersburg, Sheridan defeated a Confederate force led by General George Pickett, capturing artillery and many prisoners. After 9.5 months of fighting in the trenches around Petersburg, characterized by infantry and artillery behind the protection of defenses, it took the Union cavalry charging across an open landscape to break the siege.
At the beginning of the war, the U.S. Army could barely muster a cavalry at all, enabling the rebel cavalry to move about the landscape almost at will. Today, the Army of the Appomattox Cavalry Corps is a magnificent fighting force of 10,000 horse and horsemen, sharply attired in blue uniform and gold piping, equipped with rapid-fire carbines. They faced a ragged enemy, many without overcoats or blankets, clad in tattered remnants of jacket and pantaloons.
General Lee directed Pickett to hold Five Forks at all hazards, sending 3 brigades from the forces defending Petersburg for support. When Grant learned that Lee had weakened his defenses, he ordered a general assault. At midnight, Union guns opened fire on the Confederate fortifications. In the 10 months that Lee's army had held the line at Petersburg, they had endured many bombardments, but nothing like this one. The night sky was filled with the burning arcs of shells as they made their way towards the Confederate line. At dawn, the Union infantry attacked the weakened defenses at Petersburg.
This is Danielle Burke in Richmond. When the Confederate line was breached, General Lee telegraphed Richmond that it was necessary he abandon his position that night or run the risk of being cut off in the morning. He advised the government to make all preparation for evacuating Richmond immediately. Being Sunday, President Davis was sitting in his usual pew in St. Paul's Episcopal Church when the messenger strode up the aisle and handed him a telegram. Davis read it silently, then arose and walked quietly out of the church. The Confederate cabinet met and decided to move the government to Danville. All afternoon documents and records were hastily packed. The Confederate treasury, $500,000 in gold and silver, went at once by special train, guarded by 60 naval cadets. The presidential train followed.
This is Jackie Chase in Richmond, Virginia. At daybreak this morning, federal troops entered the abandoned Confederate capital. From the moment Union troops entered the city, blacks of Richmond jammed the sidewalks to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. No longer enslaved, they thrust out their hands to be shaken by soldiers and presented them with offerings of fruit, flowers, even jugs of whiskey. To the sounds of John Brown's Body, they danced with unimpeded joy. The capture of Richmond has been the goal of the Union Army since the beginning of the war. The Confederate capital lay tantalizingly close to Washington, only 100 miles away, but it took 4 years of hard fighting and unspeakable bloodshed to get here.
April 5th, 1865.
Upon hearing the news of the fall of Richmond, President Lincoln, accompanied by his son Tad, set sail for the Confederate capital aboard the River Queen.
Thank God that I have lived to see this. It seems to me that I have been dreaming a horrid dream for 4 years, and now the nightmare is gone. I want to see Richmond.
Negroes shouted that the president had arrived. Thinking the news was about Jefferson Davis, they cried, "Hang him! Hang him! Show him no quarter!" But when they learned it was President Lincoln, dozens of them raced to the landing, yelling and screaming, "Hallelujah!" and "Glory! President Lincoln has come!" Hearing the commotion, more blacks, men, women, and children, poured into the streets. An old man sprang forward. "Bless the Lord! There's the great Messiah!" And he fell upon his knees before the president. The others followed his example, and in a minute a throng of kneeling men, women, and children surrounded Mr. Lincoln.
Don't kneel to me, that is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy. I am but God's humble instrument. But you may rest assured that as long as I live, no one shall put a shackle on your limbs, and you shall have all the rights which God has given to every other free citizen of this republic.
Soon the president was walking through streets alive with spectators. There is no describing the scene along the route. The colored population was wild with enthusiasm. Old men thanked God in a very boisterous manner, and old women shouted as high as they had ever done at religious revival. Before departing the city, the president noticed 3 recently orphaned kittens, which were mewing piteously. He picked them up, took them on his lap, and stroked them.
Poor little creatures, don't cry. You'll be taken good care of. Colonel, see that these poor little motherless waifs are given plenty of milk and treated kindly.
To all who witnessed this expression of tenderness, it was a most extraordinary experience. After the horrors of war, the enormous loss of life and limb, the many rivers of blood, here was the man who signed the commissions of all the heroic men who served the cause of the Union, openly revealing a most generous spirit. Perhaps this is his way of saying it is now time for compassion and forgiveness.
We have now entered upon a new phase of a struggle, the memory of which is to endure for all ages and to shed an increasing luster upon our country. Relieved from the necessity of guarding cities and particular points, with an army operating on the interior of our own country, nothing is now needed to render our triumph certain but the exhibition of our own unquenchable resolve. Animated by the confidence in your spirit and fortitude which never yet has failed me, I announce to you, fellow countrymen, that it is my purpose to maintain your cause with my whole heart and soul, that I will never consent to abandon to the enemy 1 foot of the soil of any one of the states of the Confederacy. Let us not then despond, my countrymen, but relying on the never-failing mercies and protecting care of our God, let us meet the foe with fresh defiance, with unconquered and unconquerable hearts.
April 7th, 1865.
The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is racing against hunger and time as they seek to escape the Union Army's capture of Petersburg and Richmond. General Lee sent a telegraph down the railroad line for 200,000 rations to be sent ahead. Their only hope now is to outdistance the Federals in a race to Appomattox Station and badly needed rations.
Carter, General Sheridan got to Appomattox Courthouse first and placed his immense cavalry corps between Appomattox Station and the courthouse, directly across the path of Lee's retreat. A unit under command of the young General George Armstrong Custer took control of the Jetersville station and intercepted the trains carrying Confederate rations. There are no rations on their way to Appomattox.
April 8, 1865.
The splendid Army of Northern Virginia, which quickly became the envy of the world for its courage, heroism, and achievement, has been reduced to a fragment of brave men, many of whom, from exposure and want of food, cannot lift a musket to their shoulder. Desertions have intensified with each passing hour. At 8:30 this morning, General Robert E. Lee could no longer put off the inevitable. He ordered General Longstreet to stop fighting and commenced riding toward the Union front to make arrangements to see General Grant. When General Grant finally heard the news, he sent one of his aides forward to arrange a suitable place for the surrender. The courthouse itself was the most likely place in the village, but, being Sunday, was not open. The Wilmer McLean house, just a few hundred yards away, and the most prominent residence in the small village, was then selected.
April 9th, 1865.
General Lee arrived at the McLean house first and sat in a large sitting room on the first floor. At about 1 o'clock, General Grant and his staff arrived. Grant sat at a marble-topped table in the center of the room, Lee at a small oval table near the front window. General Grant, not yet 43 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, shoulders slightly stooped, was clothed in a uniform that included no marks of rank except a general's shoulder straps.
General Lee, 58 years old, 6 feet tall, hair and beard silver gray, wore a handsome uniform of Confederate gray buttoned to the throat, with 3 stars on each side of the turned-down collar and a splendid sword at his side.
The formalities were concluded without dramatic accessories. Grant did not demand Lee's sword, as is customary, but actually apologized to him for not having his own, saying it had been left behind in the wagon. He also did not allow the firing of salutes by Union soldiers to mark the event. Grant asked only that the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia surrender and give their word not to take up arms against the United States until properly exchanged. Lee accepted the terms. Lieutenant Colonel Eli Parker quietly transcribed the final copy before the 2 generals scrawled their names. Lee then conveyed to Grant that his men have been living for the last few days principally upon parched corn and are thereby badly in need of rations and forage. Grant responded that he would send 25,000 rations. Lee, ever courteous, shook each man's hand. When he got to Colonel Parker, a Seneca Indian, Lee hesitated, and then extending his hand to Parker said, "I am glad to see one real American here." Parker accepted the preferred handshake, responding, "We are all Americans." Lee went out to the front porch of the McLean house, mounted his horse Traveler, and raised his hat in salute as he rode back to his lines. The Union soldiers presented arms in a dramatic show of respect to the soldier and the man. General Lee said to all, "Let us go home and cultivate our virtues."
April 11th, 1865.
This is Jackie Chase in Washington, D.C., which is still celebrating the news that Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. A jubilant crowd gathered outside the White House calling for President Lincoln. Lincoln stood at the window over the building's main door, a place where presidents customarily gave speeches. A reporter held a light so Lincoln could read his speech, while young Tad Lincoln grasped the pages as they fluttered to his feet. For the first time in a public speech, Lincoln expressed his support for black suffrage.
The evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond and the surrender of the principal insurgent army give hope of a righteous and speedy peace, whose joyous expression cannot be restrained. In the midst of this, however, he from whom all blessings flow must not be forgotten.
For the first time publicly, Lincoln expressed support to the idea of enfranchising former slaves. In the crowd was a famous and firm supporter of the Confederate cause, John Wilkes Booth. Booth is quoted as saying, upon hearing Lincoln's words, "That means nigger citizenship. Now by God, I'll put him through." That is the last speech he will ever give.